Lesson 3, Ranches and Drivers. It is June of 1872. You and your team are driving a herd of about 3,000 cattle from Texas to Abilene, Kansas. You still have hundreds of miles to go on the dusty Chisholm Trail. You can't drive the cattle too fast or they will lose weight, so you cover only about 15 miles a day. It will take about 6 weeks to get to Abilene. The work is hard and the days are long. The sun beats down on your hat. The kerchief you wear over your face protects you from breathing in dust. At night, you sleep on the ground in your bedroll. You can't wait to get to a hot bath and a soft bed. Cattle country. The Spanish missionaries and soldiers brought cattle to Texas. When the missionaries withdrew, they left the cattle behind. As a result, settlers moving to Texas found thousands of wild cattle roaming the grasslands. The early settlers raised cattle to use as meat for their families. They used cattle for other purposes too. For example, cattle hides were used for leather, and horns and hooves were made into buckles and buttons. The tallow, or fat, of the cattle was used for candles and soap. Some settlers sold a few cattle to people in nearby towns. During the Civil War, Philip Armour sold beef to the Army. Then in 1870, Armour started a meatpacking industry in Chicago. Business people in Texas thought that the market for beef would grow. The possibility of large profits attracted people from the East and overseas to invest in raising beef. Suddenly, raising cattle became a booming business. Texas farmers and ranchers coming home from the Civil War began rounding up the wild cattle. They grazed them on grasslands until they were large enough to sell. Since there was no railroad connection in Texas yet, they took cattle to railroad towns in Kansas and Missouri. There, the cattle were loaded onto freight cars headed for meatpacking plants in Kansas City or Chicago. As the market for beef grew, cattle ranching spread northward out of Texas. Before long, not only the Southwest, but also the northern plains states as far north as Montana and the Dakotas were cattle country. The northern plains that once were grazing land for buffalo were filled with cattle. Review. How was cattle raising introduced into Texas? Cattle drive in the Southwest. Cowboys and cowgirls. Many different types of people worked on ranches, training horses and herding cattle. After the Civil War, many freed slaves hired on as cowhands. Native Americans and European settlers also worked as cowhands. In South Texas, where some ranches were owned by Mexican families, many cowboys were of Mexican descent. In fact, the Mexican vaqueros of South Texas taught the newer settlers how to be cowboys. The life of the cowboy shown today in books, movies, songs, and on TV was far from real life. Cowhands rarely fought Native Americans. They worked long hours. They often spent more than 12 hours a day on horseback. On trail drives, the cowhands took turns guarding the cattle throughout the night. Cowhands slept on the ground and rarely carried guns. Cowgirls were also a part of the Old West. Only a few women went on cattle drives. The most famous cowgirls took part in rodeos and Wild West shows. Annie Oakley was a sharpshooter who had her own show. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Cannery, was also a famous cowgirl. She performed shooting displays in Wild West shows. Review. What was the life of a real cowhand like? The Chisholm Trail. In 1865, Jesse Chisholm, a trader who was part Native American, blazed or marked a trail from San Antonio, Texas to Abilene, Kansas. As railroad lines were extended, the trail also went to Ellsworth, Kansas, and other cities. The Chisholm Trail went through Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Some Native American groups charged a toll of 10 cents a head for cattle driven through their land. They also charged a grazing fee for the grass the cattle ate along the way. The toll on the Chisholm Trail could be paid with a head or two of cattle. Many ranchers began using this trail. While the rivers along the trail provided water, they were also hazards. The cattle were afraid of water and had to be forced to cross rivers. After heavy rain, some cattle were swept away by swiftly running rivers. At times, the cattle got stuck in mud or quicksand along the rivers. Getting the cattle across the rivers was a difficult and dangerous job for the cowboys. Review. Why did ranchers like the Chisholm Trail? Map adventure. The Chisholm Trail. Many cowboys driving their herds from San Antonio, Texas to Abilene, Kansas used the Chisholm Trail. Suppose you are a cowhand driving a herd along this trail. 1. If you leave from San Antonio, Texas, what river will you cross to reach Cheyenne territory? 2. In what main direction will you be traveling? 3. What is the second major river that you must cross? How ranching influenced the Southwest. As more railroads were built in the Southwest, the distance from the ranches to the railroads became shorter and shorter. The days of long cattle drives were over. Cowhands now worked in different jobs on the ranches. By 1890, ranchers could no longer graze their cattle on the open range. This was partly due to the increasing number of settlers who were moving to the Southwest. The U.S. government granted land to settlers for a few dollars if they would live on the land and raise crops. The land given to a settler was called a homestead. To keep animals out of their fields, homesteaders fenced their land. Cattle ranchers also began to fence their land to keep their animals from wandering off. As a result, the grasslands were no longer available for shared grazing. Ranchers began to decrease the size of their herds to a number that could graze on their land. At the same time, they began to raise crops to feed their animals during the winter. The ranchers also began to drill water wells so their animals didn't have to travel a long way to drink. Some large ranches still remain in the Southwest. Among them is the King Ranch. It was established in 1853, and it is still in business. This ranch spreads over 800,000 acres in South Texas. It is larger than the state of Rhode Island. The King Ranch is also used for scientific studies of cattle and cattle diseases. Review. How did fences affect cattle ranching in the Southwest?